Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm very excited to welcome you to a great conversation tonight between Professor Mary Frances O'Connor and Dr. Kathy Shear. Thanks for attending. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for introductions. Mary Frances O'Connor is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress GLASS Lab, which investigates the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Her research focuses on the physiological correlates of emotion, in particular, the wide range of physical and emotional responses during bereavement, including yearning and isolation. Dr. Kathy Shear is the Marianne E. Kenworthy Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia School of Social Work. Dr. Shear began her work with studies of panic disorder by participating in the development and extensive testing of a cognitive behavioral therapy for panic. Dr. Shear began studying grief in 1995, and her adaptation-focused grief intervention has the strongest evidence base of any grief treatment to date. This is a very special pairing of two incredible researchers, and now let's listen and learn.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. It's so lovely to have so many of you here. We're really looking forward to this evening, Kathy and I, actually. Kathy and I love to get a chance to talk to each other, and it doesn't happen as often as we wish it did, does it, Kathy?
It certainly doesn't, and I share your enthusiasm for this evening.
You know, it's interesting. People often ask me why I wrote this book, The Grieving Brain. And I have to say that in having enough conversations with people, you know, sitting on airplanes, students in classrooms and so forth, it became really clear to me that the general public doesn't really know how much scientific research has been done on grief and grieving. And while, of course, we wish there was more being done, or there certainly will be more done, it was an opportunity to really put down what I thought was the most important things for people to know. And, you know, Kathy and I are we're the grief experts. We look at the patterns in the data, but each of you is your own expert on your own grief. And so we're always curious what people will be able to apply to their own situation. So I'm looking forward to this a lot. Would you say, Kathy, is that how you think about it?
I do, and I want to say that I'm so grateful to you for doing this, because you're absolutely right that people are so hungry for information about grief, especially really in these last couple of years when we sadly have had such an increase in the deaths that have occurred around the world, but in our country especially. And so it's, you know, and the other thing I want to say about your book is that as Lonnie said, I've been doing this work for a long time. I don't want to count the years, but it's totally captured my kind of interest and imagination, and the people that I've worked with, grieving people, that's really, as she said, my work has focused really on treatment, and they've been some of the most amazing people that I've had the opportunity to work with in my career. So that's part of it. But what I want to say again about the book is that one of the things that we do in the therapy is to try to explain grief to people. And you have done such a spectacular job of doing that in a way that's so accessible. And, you know, I've been reading myself about, I read all of the science of grief. I stay pretty up to date with it, but I still found that I learned things from your book, Mary Frances, and I also found that you said things that I knew already in ways that were just really, really great. So I think people are going to flock to want to read this book.
Wonderful.
But, you know, I guess we want to talk a little about how we understand grief, right? So, I mean, I'm wondering actually if you might have some thoughts about why it is that it's so hard for any of us, when, one of the things that happens after someone close dies is that we can't quite understand. We know they're gone, but we can't understand really what that means. We don't get it, that they're not coming back. We're looking
Yeah.
for them, we just don't get it. And it seems so strange. It's one of the strange things about grief, don't you think?
I do. There are so many strange things about grief. It never feels quite like you anticipated it might. But I think this is one of the most interesting things for me, that taking a neuroscience lens, which is maybe not the first thing people think of when they think about grief, but looking at it from the perspective of what the brain has to do to understand what the heck is going on, has helped me to really hone in on exactly this question. Why is it so hard to understand that the person has died and is gone forever? Joan Didion wrote about this so beautifully in her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, where she wrote, I just couldn't get rid of my husband's shoes after her husband had died because he was going to need them again. And so, even in that sentence, you sort of get that feeling of, she knows it to be true. She is a perfectly sane person. And at the same time, it doesn't feel true.
Yeah.
And I think one of the surprising things maybe about the brain is that the brain can rely on multiple sources of information at the same time. It tries to resolve them, but it is going to, refer to multiple forms of information. So one piece of information is, of course, the person is gone. So we saw them decline as they were ill, or we were there even, in the hospital room or in the bedroom when they passed away. We got the phone call, whatever it was. We have this in our memory. But there's another kind of information that the brain relies on. And when we think about attachment, when we think about bonding with that, our one and only, whether that's our parent or our spouse or our child, there are physiological changes that occur in the brain when that bonding happens. And along with those physiological changes comes this belief. They are there for me, right? I trust them. They are out there for me. If they're not around, the solution is to go get them, or to, wail and cry and have them come to me. And so you have these two pieces of information. On the one hand, you have memories, that this person is gone. And on the other hand, you still have this deep belief that they are out there. And those two things, part of the reason I say grieving is a form of learning is it takes a long time to resolve those two pieces of information. But, Kathy, one of the things I'm very curious to get your perspective on actually is, why do you think grief causes so many emotions, such intense emotions? We think of sadness and anger and blame and guilt and yearning. Why do you think so many intense emotions come along?
Yeah, because it's such a complex situation is the simple answer to that. But, I want to add just a teeny bit to what you were just talking about, because you were talking about our close relationships using the frame of attachment theory, which people may or may not be familiar with, but it is a major theory in the field of psychology that explains, and there's a tremendous amount of research that you summarize so nicely in the book, underpinning it, neurobiological research and also psychological research. But one of the things that we know about our close relationships is that they have a special place in our memory. You didn't mention memory, and I think memory is kind of important here, because they sort of reside in all kinds of, memory is so complex, and maybe you might have some comments about that too. But part of our memory is completely out of our awareness. So we may be able to learn at the most kind of obvious superficial level that the person is gone, but in those deeper memory, that's really what we're talking about with learning, right? Is changing our memories or making new memories or whatever. So, and that actually starts to get at the answer to your question, which is the emotions that are connected with grief are, first of all, I'm going to take the last one first. I think you mentioned yearning, which of course is a central interest of yours as well. But yearning is kind of the core of grief. A lot of people think of sorrow, even Merriam-Webster dictionary thinks sorrow is at the heart of grief, but really it's yearning that's at the heart of grief. And that's because if you stop to think about it, if what happens to the affection that you feel for someone that you love when they're not around, does it get stronger or does it get weaker? And I think
it gets stronger, so much stronger.
So much stronger. And, and that was, I actually asked a class that I was teaching, I asked that question and someone said almost exactly what you just said. And I thought, yeah, that's really true. I mean, I guess I sort of knew it, but anyway, so that's the first thing that happens is that we want them so much. In fact, if there's anything threatening that goes on in our lives or anything that seems to threaten that person, that's immediately what we feel. We want them. And I think you were saying that. So that's the yearning. And then, and then some part of our brain is going to say, but they're gone and I can't have them. And when you can't have something you want, big emotions come from that, right? So we get mad about it a lot. That's part of that anger that is often present. Yeah. And we also get scared. We get anxiety is big time. There's a lot of anxiety and grief that people have only recently been able to, been starting to talk about. Yeah. So that and also the other thing is when the people one other thing about people we're close to is they provide two basic functions that are very complex, but the functions are to be what we call a safe haven and a secure base. And so because they provide those for us, someone's got to be on the other side providing it. And also we're going to do the same thing for them. And that's a system like attachment, which is called a caregiving system. And that caregiving system, when someone that we care about and that we're feeling that we should be a safe haven and a secure base for, when that person is gone, we blame ourselves, whether it's, even if they're halfway across the world and this happens, we blame ourselves. So there's a lot of self-blame actually in grief. It's all of this is very natural and it happens to all of us. And really the thing that matters kind of in the longer run is what we do with that. But that's another question. And actually it does relate to a question I wanted to ask you, which is why does it take so long? Why do we grieve for such a long time?
When I work with medical residents, they always want, they want to pin me down. So how long does it take? And I say, well, that question doesn't really make sense, but they really want to know the answer. Yeah. I think it's more important to think about why it might take so long. And this is another place where I really think about it from the perspective of the brain. Mm-hmm. And I think of it this way. So, the heart is there to pump blood around the body. That's its job. And the brain is really there to help us predict what might happen next, right? And by predicting what might happen next, we're hopefully maybe able to prepare a little better for it or interact with our world better. But when you think about it, when we have, woken up next to someone for thousands and thousands of days, and then we wake up one morning and they're not there next to us in bed, it actually isn't a very good prediction that they have died. And it takes the brain a long time, partly because it is also a physiological process. So some of the work from Zoe Donaldson, who I know you know from University of Colorado Boulder, has studied this in the brains of voles, right? These little rodents who mate for life. And what we see is there are actually neurons that are specifically designed to focus on, to react to fire when we're approaching our partner. And there are more of those, the stronger that the bond gets. So now if you think about it, it takes time for the body to even physically rewire what its expectations are about the world, right? So another example might be, if you are, if your wife has come in every day, at 6 o'clock from work, it's the usual sort of process. She comes in, the garage door goes up, she comes in, and it's 6 o'clock and you hear a sound. You actually experience, my wife is getting home. And then you have the remembrance, my wife is gone. She's not actually coming home. But the key here is you already had the experience, right, of her coming in, and then you remembered. And so this learning takes a very long time. It's very complex for the brain to do. And I think that's a lot of why it takes longer than most people would imagine, But here's a question for you, Kathy, that I think you've thought about a lot, which is, does grieving ever take too long, do you think?
Yeah, and that's actually how I got involved in studying grief in the very beginning, because I had colleagues who were starting to identify a persistent, pervasive form of grief, which we called complicated grief back then. And then we called it traumatic grief for a while. And now we call it prolonged grief disorder. But it's been studied now worldwide in all different cultures, in all different age groups, actually, and people in all different kinds of situations. And it's very clear that there is a form of grief that is just kind of stuck in a way, that it isn't going anywhere. It's sort of almost like people that I've seen over the years, they might be 4 or 5, even 10 or 20 years after the person died, and they still have a sort of feeling that it's like they just died yesterday, which is kind of what you were describing as in that moment with the car in the garage. But this is like all the time. They're not getting there. And so there's a lot of evidence for this. And really what it is, I mean, I think it's not a completely different kind of grief, actually.
Right.
It's just that there are certain processes, really psychological processes, maybe neurobiological ones that you're going to uncover, that, eventually, that maybe there is a neurobiological predisposition to this. We don't see it right now, from our work. But certain kinds of things can get in the way of the process that we call adapting to the loss, which includes basically what you have to do is you have to find a way to really understand and accept the reality that you're in, the finality of it, that thing, what you've been talking about. And you also have, the other thing about grief is that about not any grief, but losing someone close, which is what we're talking about, is that it isn't only their loss that happens when they die, because it's, it really affects your whole entire life. And it affects other people. And so there are so many changes that you also have to kind of understand and live through and deal with, basically. And the last thing is you also, it also undermines your sense of self and your own sense of connection to your own values sometimes, and your own interests. You feel like, who am I and what do I care about anymore? You don't even know. And you feel incompetent, and you feel also disconnected from everyone else around. It doesn't feel like, you feel like you don't know if you can care about anyone else, or if you do. It's very confusing. And all of you kind of have to deal with all that. So that's how I think of what takes so long. And when you get stuck in one of those places, it's pretty easy to happen. In a way, this only happens to maybe 7 to 10% of people who lose someone very, very close. And that to me is kind of amazing. And it's a testament to human resilience.
Right. That means 9 in 10 people who lose someone, there is suffering, there is difficulty, there's a ton of emotions, but it's not the same as prolonged grief disorder. And I think of it a lot about functioning, right? So it's sort of that, I can't get dinner on the table, or I can't get out to work, or I think you described it the other day, you're just sort of going through the motions, like you're doing all the things, right? Would you say?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, and people, some people do all the things so well that people around them don't quite notice it.
Yeah.
But what the people close to them always notice it because they're not emotionally available.
Yes, that's
And
right. Exactly.
those people try and try and try, and they eventually start telling people not to talk about the person
Yeah.
who died anymore. It's enough already, they say. And
Yeah.
that turns out to be kind of cruel in this situation. They don't mean to be cruel, but they don't know
No.
what to do.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it is difficult to be with a person who is in grief for lots of reasons. We're all afraid we're going to say the wrong thing, or we're afraid we're going to make it worse. Right.
Yes.
And I think ironically, the person who is grieving needs to be okay being as upset as they are while having someone there who really cares for them. And so that's not the same as cheering them up, right? To sort of be with them in that moment. But I think back to the sort of grieving as a form of learning, also seeing what has changed over time, right? Like, I think part of your description of getting stuck is that often people are then very much avoiding, right? Things that they would be able to do that in the long run might turn out to be enjoyable. So even the first time you do it, it may not be enjoyable, right? You think, I'm not going to this dinner because it's going to be terrible. And, maybe the first time it's not great, but maybe then over time it becomes a little better.
Yeah, exactly.
I think of avoidance as one of those things that complicates the learning process. Your brain really needs experiences to learn new ways of being in the world. That thing you were describing about it being really close people to you, even if you think about like the word sister or the word daughter, that word implies two people, right? So sister could describe me, but it actually implies there is another person there. And so trying then to figure out, well, what does it mean for me to be in the light, in the world, and be a sister, because you're still carrying the person with you. So what does it mean to be in the world and be a parent if my child has died, or be a daughter if my mother has died, right? So I think that difficulty requires some time, but also requires some courage to try some new things and get experiences that then, if you're in the present moment, trying to understand if they're working for you or not.
Yeah, I mean, and the truth is that avoiding things that activate grief, when you're grieving pretty intensely already, it makes sense, right? It makes sense not to barrage yourself, I mean, and actually one of the things that we've learned is that it's a really good idea to actually set the grief aside at times. You really want to kind of oscillate between confronting the pain and then setting it aside. And so but then what happens sometimes is that people get kind of caught up in they start to think that the only way they can get any relief from the intensity of the pain is by avoiding it, by setting it aside, by, either it's almost like pretending it didn't happen, but it's people will sometimes have like daydreaming, or they'll do things like spend hours looking at pictures or listening to the person's voice or even smelling their clothes. It's almost everybody does a little of this, by the way. It's not weird and abnormal, but and then they get caught up in that, and then they don't want to do things where the absence is so in your face. And that's the kind of avoidance that you're talking about, that doesn't let you kind of gradually doesn't get you to that party that you might not really go to, but you got to go anyway.
There's from the brain neuroimaging studies side, I think there's just some fascinating work done by Noam Schneck out of Columbia University, where you're housed. And in some of the brain imaging studies that he's done, which are very complex, they use machine learning, and they're, even I find them difficult to write about in the book, right? Like, it takes me a while to sort of put it down in words. But here's the upshot that I really take away from some of his work is what he discovered, because it's hard to study avoidance, right? Because you can't ask someone if they're avoiding, because that's the whole, that's what they're doing. And so what he found, though, was that people who were demonstrating more avoidance, we could actually see sort of the fingerprint in the brain activity, where people who were avoiding more, the thought of the person who had died actually popped into their head more than people who avoided less, right? Such an ironic process. And yet, if that is then true, we have to find other ways for people other than avoidance to manage the really significant pain that they feel when they think about the reality of the loss.
Right. And that actually sort of is connected in a way to accepting the reality, which many people say to us, I will never accept it. I don't want to accept it.
Yeah.
Or I'm afraid to accept it. I'm afraid that I will never, I'll fall into an abyss that I'll never be able to get out of. And so then, that resistance, though, paradoxically, it fuels the avoidance, because it makes it feel like you've got to stay away from all these places.
Yeah.
And it's a paradox, because it actually makes you more afraid, actually.
Yeah.
Avoidance, that's the other thing about avoidance. The more you avoid something, it's called negative reinforcement, a kind of odd name for it, which but so what you actually say to yourself turns out to be pretty important too. I think in reaching some of those areas of the brain is the way I think of it. You know a lot more about that than I do. but I'm pretty sure that we reach areas of our brain by both talking to ourselves, also by visualizing things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating work around visualization.
Yeah.
Learning.
The thing that strikes me is, we're talking about, on the one hand, there's dealing with the loss feeling, sort of the tip of what we think of as grief, right? But I often think about also the other side of it, the sort of restoring a meaningful life.
Yeah.
So I make, I make this distinction in the book between grief and grieving. So grief is this feeling, that knocks you off your feet, and just the ferocity of it. But grieving is the change in that experience of grief over time, even though grief doesn't go away, right? So grief is a natural reaction to having lost something. I can open a drawer and see, the signature of my mom, say, for example, who died over 20 years ago. And somehow just seeing that signature in that moment will make me well up. And, I'm flooded with memories of her. And that's totally normal. If people are expecting that there's some end point where they aren't going to become overwhelmed with grief anymore, that's actually not usually a sign that grief is integrated. It's not that you're never going to feel it again. It's that you change in the ways that you experience it. And in one way, it's sort of being able to restore a meaningful life for yourself while there is grief along with it. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds so right. And I think it's so important. I mean, it's one of the things, that what I was saying before about the way that we make and you do too, and neurobiologically, but also kind of just personally, we make a connection between the love that we feel for someone and grieving when they die. And what I've come to understand is that love is actually the form that grief is the form that love takes.
Yeah.
When someone we love dies.
Yeah.
That's something that C.S. Lewis, he wrote that famous book of Grief Observed, which is a very beautiful description.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely.
And he makes that point really clearly. And it's something that we try to help people see, because if you think about it that way, then you don't feel so strongly like you have to worry about it. We don't want people worrying about grief. So we say grief emerges naturally and finds a place in your life. And that's what you're talking about. It needs a place in your life. It doesn't need to go away. It needs a place in your life.
That's right. And it reminds me of this term we use, continuing bonds. I find this to be a very useful way of thinking about it. This idea that it isn't just that the relationship isn't going to go away. You're not going to forget them. They are permanently stamped into your neurons, right?
Exactly.
There are epigenetic changes. They are not going away. The
Right.
question is sort of, how do you relate to them now? Because you're carrying them in your mind, in your memory, in your heart. And so I think that knowing, a lot of people, we did a daily diary study recently, a lot of people continue to feel the presence of the person. They talk to them, they see things in the world that feel like they're there because their loved one, because of the relationship they had with their loved one. I love this woman told us that she was having a really difficult conversation with her son, and whose father had died, her husband. And she said, as I'm having this conversation, it's like my husband is giving me the words, right, to be able to say to him, because I don't know what to say to him. I'm going to say this because this may feel like a bit of an aside, but, Kathy and I are not child grief experts. And so we know that there are usually a lot of questions about the experience of grief among children, which is definitely an area of expertise of some people, but not us. And so we've offered some resources that you might be able to consult. I think they'll probably ultimately pop up in the chat. So I just wanted to make that note while we're here.
Yeah.
And while we're in this funny moment, you go ahead, Kathy.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yeah, we both wanted to try and remember to say that. But the other thing that makes me think of, Kathy, is a lot of people have asked me, and I'm sure ask you, is the death of a loved one the only thing that causes grief? And even in brain imaging studies, I mean, even if we just stick with death for a moment, there's a brain imaging study of pet loss. Mm-hmm. And there's a brain imaging study of women who have lost a pregnancy. And in both of those cases, the brain region responsiveness, the particular type, the pattern of responses that we see in different regions actually looks incredibly similar. And I just find that so interesting to think that we really are bonding, right? It's the bonding that kind of matters. And it's partly because that's a part of us then, right? That we've lost. So I think, what would you say when you're asked?
Yeah, no, exactly. And well, so there's also evidence from survey studies and such that we grieve all kinds of losses. In fact, I worked with Ron Kessler, who you may know, he's a psychiatric epidemiologist, and he did a epidemiologic study after Hurricane Katrina and measured all kinds of losses. Of course, there were many, many kinds of losses. In that hurricane, actually, loss by death was not that. I mean, there were obviously people died, but not that there were a lot more other kinds of losses. And he asked people grief questions about all of their losses. And then we analyzed the data, and the rate of what we kind of understood to be prolonged grief in that sample was elevated. It was most elevated after the death of someone close, quite a bit more than other losses, but every single kind of loss was associated with some even prolonged grief. Not only, I mean, certainly grief, but prolonged grief. And actually, so the number of people experiencing that was much greater for other non-death losses.
Yeah. And I think we see that so much right now. I'm glad that there is a conversation around it. I think many of us feel we've lost a part of ourselves in the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that meant the loss or change of a job, the loss of just habit, right? The loss of sort of knowing you could go out to work and your kids went out to school, and, the loss of being able to dance together, and, so many different things. I think that what you say is right. I mean, from my perspective, I think it is possible that evolutionarily this was, we have a huge human need for each other. We absolutely don't survive without other people. And so knowing what an important need that is, I think that the brain may have evolved, and that grief response is sort of the natural response to the death of a close person. But it doesn't mean that the brain then doesn't use that as a similar mechanism when other aspects have been lost as well.
Yeah, I mean, the brain is parsimonious, right? I mean,
Yep.
we know that we use this, for example, emotional warmth and physical warmth are basically in very similar place in the brain, right? And
Yeah.
physical and social pain it's the
Yeah.
same thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It really does.
The other thing that this makes me think of, I'm not sure why, but the other thing that people ask me about a lot, or that they find useful, is what I call the would've, could've, should've, right? So this is, you and I might call it ruminating, right? These thoughts that just keep running through your head and just won't stop. And it's really often around, the doctor should have done this, or if only I could have gotten them to the hospital sooner, or, there are so many stories. And I think something that I've come to realize is human brains are phenomenal in that we can time travel and we can make up a million metaverses that never happened, right? And while that is a
Not yet.
wonderful, right, or haven't happened yet, while that is a wonderful human function of the brain, it also means, the challenge with the would have, should have, could have questions is there is actually no answer. Right? There are an infinite number of them. And to me, almost as importantly, they each, if you think about it, each of those stories ends in, and my loved one didn't die.
Right.
Right? And the reality is that they did die. And so when you're sort of spending a lot of time in these other, what we might call counterfactuals, right? Counterfactual universes, even though we don't think about it that way, it actually means that there's not as much time in what reality just is for us, and what that means for us. What does it mean that, we're not going to retire?
And so it's a form of avoidance.
Exactly.
Like we were talking about before. Yeah, I mean, can I say one more thing about that? Because you use the word counterfactual, and this is formally, I think, in psychology, counterfactual thinking. And we do it. It turns out there are psychologists who just have dedicated their lives to studying counterfactual thinking. And it's very, very interesting. Yeah. And it's something that we do automatically. I think I think every single person, and we can do it in two ways, though. We can do it. What you're describing, as you know, is called upward counterfactual thinking. Upward meaning a better outcome. But we also do downward counterfactual thinking, and and we do one or the other whenever anything that we want is not forthcoming. If any goal is blocked, it's a natural thing to do. And actually, in the most trivial situations, we do this, and we also do it in grief. But in many situations, especially ones that recur, when we do something and it doesn't come out very well, but we can do it again. Yeah. And it's very helpful. It's absolutely actually adaptive to have this kind of thinking. Yeah. But when we can't do it again, then it's not so good. And I think it kind of interacts with our predisposition to say, to kind of protest, to have that feeling of disbelief and protest, and also the way that we want to blame somebody. Yeah. So that's to me, that's the caregiver side of us, because we really wanted to take care of that person, and they're not taken care of by us or the person. Maybe that can make us really angry at medical staff, or it can make us really angry at someone else in the family, or but then we get into the counterfactuals from there, and that's, I think, that is definitely one of the ways that people then go down a pathway that, paradoxically, again, it feels in the moment, it's kind of a relief. Yeah. You can imagine a different outcome, and it seems a very real possibility of a different outcome. And that's relieving. But only for a little while, and then it gets, then it interferes with our ability to kind of make peace or learn.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I actually think this, for me, I've been doing a lot of research on pandemic grief of late, right? Since this is what we're all dealing with, and not just sort of what does that feel like, or how many people is this happening to, but really thinking about what about this circumstance might make grief different. Certainly one thing is that so many people are experiencing bereavement all at the same time. So we're used to having this group of people, we can rely on for support, and probably they are also now grieving in many cases. But aside from that, this idea that the way that deaths happen now in many cases is very unusual for human beings. So, a woman in her 70s that I was interviewing talked about dropping her husband off at the ER. He, was having some trouble breathing, but real healthy guy. And, over the next few days, the next thing she knows is he's being taken off a respirator, and, she's on a Facebook while he's actually passing away. And not to be there, not to be able to provide that caring, that caregiving in person, whether it's in hospital or at home or in the nursing home, right? So many of us have been separated from our loved ones who are in long-term care over such a long period of time, and knowing that they can be confused about why that is. This not being able to provide care toward the end of life is very unnatural for human beings, and I think leads us to a little more difficulty with, just as I was saying before, like even just sort of the reality of this having happened, right? We don't have that sort of preparation. We haven't had that goodbye conversation. And then worse yet, we often don't have funerals or memorials, or haven't been contributing again, right?
Yeah.
To fewer ways to sort of really sink into the reality of what's happened. I think that's part of what makes it unusual.
Yeah, and on top of that is how the person contracted the illness, and how they got infected, which 9 times out of 10 involves someone else in the family
who's close to them.
Who either maybe inadvertently brought the infection into the house, or even if they didn't, they also had COVID and they didn't die. And so that actually adds to something else we should probably mention, which is survivor guilt.
Yeah.
Because survivor guilt is also virtually universal. And it's that feeling of it can be guilt itself, but it can be just a feeling of really discomfort or uneasiness about going on in life in a positive way, because this person can't do that. This person you love can't, or even any other person. I think we feel a little bit of it anytime we hear of someone dying. It feels, it feels like we're lucky, and why are we so lucky? And maybe we shouldn't be so lucky, or whatever it is. But we tend to experience survivor guilt, which can also really get in the way of restoring, as you were saying, that capacity for well-being that's so important.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Just the other day, I was talking with a woman who was telling me that, or actually, I think it was a man who was telling me that he couldn't listen to music. It felt like sort of unfair to be listening to music when I think his mother had died, and when she couldn't listen to music. And I was thinking of that sort of protesting again, right? This sort of like, this shouldn't have happened. And so this is sort of my protest. I'm not going to do this, almost as this protest. And the difficulty with that isn't going to change the outcome, right? And so him not having a more meaningful life doesn't change the reality at all. Although again, I'm just reminded of how these things have to come. I'm curious, actually, as a clinician, how you think about this, because advice is very infrequently helpful for bereaved people, I think. Insight sort of has to come from the inside. How do you navigate that, Kathy?
Well, that's, I never thought of it quite the way you just said it, because it's absolutely true that the last thing, and it's true, 2 things are true. One is whenever anyone, an ordinary person, and certainly any help anyone in the helping professions sits with someone who's emotionally very upset, in emotional pain, we want to help. We want to make it go away. We want to comfort them. We want to do something to make the pain go away. It's just, we call that sometimes a righting reflex, that it is almost reflexive, and it really doesn't help. It can be very, very off-putting, actually, to a grieving person who's already feeling a little bit hesitant about relationships and a little disconnected from other people. And then, it feels to them like you're saying, well, it's not that bad, honey. You can do this or do that and you'll feel better, but you're not going to feel better. And so it just feels like the person isn't understanding.
Yeah.
But what I thought of when you said this is that said, your book, if someone, if we take it into the clinic, if we read it to the person that we're working with, or, do some form of providing some really good information about what grief is like and what the process is like and what kinds of things can help it, that doesn't register in the same way.
No.
But I think it's partly in the way that we first we establish a kind of relationship that the person knows that we understand that they are, we're not trying to say, like, go home and think about this differently and come back tomorrow and you'll be all better. It's not like that.
No. Yeah, that's right. And I sometimes think of, I face this myself just to make everyone feel better. I've said terrible things to close friends who were grieving. And I realized, 30 seconds later, that was a terrible thing to say. So we are all, we all do it. It's a reflex, isn't it, to try and make them feel better. I have found over time, there are some relationships where it helps to share your own experience of grief, right? So I think one of the ways that we overcome feeling so alone because we have lost this person is to have the experience of, it's not just that I have grief so much as there is grief, right? Grief is part and parcel with being human. And what it can mean is kind of connecting you with all the people that have come before you, all the people who are going through it at the same time. They may not have your same experience, and they may not even be able to understand exactly your experience, but they too have known grief. And there can be this feeling of kind of solidarity of, if you can kind of see it from that perspective. It's not always possible, but there are times when suddenly that can kind of click in. If you're talking with someone who has experienced grief and there's any sort of synchronicity there, that can be a wonderful moment. And I think that's part of why that can be true with a clinician.
Right. I think the way I would connect with what you're saying is that a lot of people get quite a lot of comfort from grief support groups.
Yeah.
It's more, I think it's more that sometimes a person that you don't know who has experienced some kind of, especially some kind of similar loss. It works best, I think, when, like with the COVID loss, if someone else has had a COVID loss, if it's a child loss, if someone else has had a child loss, or a spouse, or, an older spouse compared to a younger spouse, even because there is, I think, there is also a risk in, in a lot of times people will say, oh, I know how you feel because, I lost so-and-so. And that doesn't quite well, right?
Doesn't connect.
Yeah.
But that feeling of being normal, I think if I'm at if I boil down most of the questions I get, it is, am I normal? Is my grief normal? And, it's so individual and it's so natural that almost always the answer is yes.
I think so. The way I think about it is the answer is always yes. And I think the reason it's yes is because grief is simply the response to loss. That's what it is. And so there's how can you have the wrong response to loss? It's always the right response for you. It can be problematic in ways, but it's not that there's a problem with your grief.
No.
And there really isn't a right or wrong way to grieve.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think, I'm always cautious in these moments to also say, certainly if people are feeling that life isn't worth living, or they can't get through the day without drinking a lot of alcohol, there are definitely reactions that suggest, please reach out to a professional, to a counselor, to a pastor, whomever. It is so important to reach out, because this isn't going to be the same forever. And we want to support you and get you through that period of time. So I think that is the tiny caveat that I put on it. But you're absolutely right. And I sometimes think when people say, when will this be over? I sometimes use the analogy, when did you get over your wedding day?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Like, that's
great.
not
Yeah.
really a question that makes sense.
Right.
And I think, this is an event that has profoundly changed your life. And that's not going away. That's not going to change. How we go about reacting to that, reacting to our own grief experience, and what things we decide to be willing to explore and try new, it takes great courage, but it doesn't mean that that it's going to go away.
Right, and it doesn't mean, and it doesn't mean that it's going to go away. And it also, I think we don't grieve well alone. So
Yes.
reaching out, like you were saying, if you don't have someone who's a close confidant that you can talk with,
Yeah.
then find someone. It doesn't actually, in grief, it doesn't have to be someone who knows you well, actually, already. It
Yeah.
can be anyone who really can sit with you and
Yeah.
be present with you. And there are many, many wonderful grief counselors out there who can do just that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Mary Frances and Dr. Scheer, it's been such a pleasure to listen to the two of you. You have the combined knowledge. I'm sure we've only just scratched the surface of just all the experience that the two of you bring to the table. So I want to thank you for that. I want to ask a couple questions. They're kind of falling into a couple baskets here. So I want to kind of get to them. But I also want to remind folks that both Mary Frances and Dr. Scheer are going to be joining us for after hours. That'll start at about 8:05. It is a separate Zoom altogether. People can ask their own questions. You can unmute yourself. You have your cameras on, so it's much more conversational as well. So just please be aware that we just put a link in chat about how to get access to after hours. So Mary Frances, I'm going to go with a couple things. One, if you could just state fairly straightforwardly so that people definitely get the message. Can you talk a little bit about grief that is not related to death? Physical death of a spouse, death of a child, etc. People want to know about the kind of grief that comes with loss. Primarily, a couple of people are asking about divorce in particular, where that person is actually still walking around on the planet, but that there is without question loss. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then I'm also going to take you a little bit. There's some questions people want to know specifically about the neuroscience and the brain activity. So
sure,
maybe
sure.
if you handle the loss and divorce piece first, that would be great.
Yeah. I think, there is no doubt to start that divorce and other types of dissolution also bring grief. And we can think about, when you think about what is it that's lost, it is when a bond is lost, right? And so that bond is irrevocably changed with something like divorce. And it can creep up in funny other ways, right? So you can discover that, an ex-boyfriend has died or something like that, right? So there are many ways in which our bonds sort of change over time, but that can ultimately lead to this natural response of loss. And so I think of it, even in the brain, when that bond has happened, that sort of self and other, the neurons are actually quite overlapping in many cases. And so when you're operating in the world then without the we, when you're having to start telling stories as I, that's a big shift. And that is the feeling of loss, I think, that many people experience.
And kind of along those lines, just as a sidebar question that goes into that, Mead asked, can you speak to grieving the loss of an idea or a hope or an expectation as opposed to grieving a death? or in this case, divorce. She speaks about her son was born with a severe developmental disability that will never be he will never be the person that she thought he would be. He's 13, and while she's accepted his circumstances, she still mourns this loss, and it comes in waves and unexpectedly. So in this case, it was more a your dream of and hopes for the child, that piece, and maybe talk a little bit about that as a corollary to what you were just saying.
Sure. And Kathy might have a good comment on this. Do you want to say something, Kathy?
I mean, I was thinking, to some degree, what I was thinking is to some degree, all grief is exactly that, right? Because when we lose someone that we have a strong relationship with and who is the person that we really want them to be, what we're really losing, we don't lose the past with them, right? We don't lose the relationship we've already had. We lose the imagined future, which is really what you're talking about here. It's just that the past is different. I mean, so I think it's a really good question, but I do think,
And I think it relates to sort of ambiguous loss, which I know many people before had questions about before the talk tonight. And I think it's a similar thing. It's I had this idea in my head, I had this expectation, I maybe even lived for a while with this person in one way, and it's not that way now. And I want it to be the way it was, right? And that loss, the loss of personality, say with dementia, or the loss of health with caregiving, right? The loss of function, all of those are really significant losses. And I think, parenting is a lot of little losses all the way along, right? You lose them as a 5-year-old, then you lose them as a 10-year-old, then you lose them as a 15-year-old, right? So I think that even if they're exactly what you had hoped, you still lose them who they were. And that's, I think, even compounded when it isn't what you had imagined.
Okay, I'm going to jump into something a little bit more about cognitive capacities. Camilla wants to know, and we only have about 2 minutes, so we're going to go slightly lightning round here. How are cognitive capacities affected in a grieving brain?
I would say that in 2 ways. This is the lightning version. You could read more about it in the book, I swear.
Of course.
The first way that I talk about is, sometimes I say it's like grieving is like learning to do calculus while running a marathon. Your whole body is reacting, right, physiologically with a lot of stress hormones. That affects your thinking. And then all those habits, all those things that you did automatically, your brain is running in the background, trying to figure out what you do now. And all of those things going on can make it very difficult to concentrate on anything. That is totally normal and very typical. That does not mean that there will be long-term damage. That doesn't mean cognitive impairment in mid or later life often are having a more difficult time adjusting, we think in part because grieving is in fact a learning process, and we need sort of a healthy brain, or at least a healthy brain really helps with that process. And so I think that's newer evidence that we're just still trying to figure out now.
Okay, and then we'll go with one more question that has to do with, and this will be kind of like the practical how-to. Susan is asking, give even just 2 suggestions how to get unstuck. Like if you were to just, and I know it's very individual, you both have made points about every grief in some ways is probably similar and unique at the same time. But if you were to give 2 pieces of advice that may or may not work for absolutely everyone, where would you start with someone?
So you can give 2 pieces and I'll give 2 pieces and see if they overlap.
Okay,
you go first, Kathy. You're the clinician.
As long as you're both done in 1 minute. So go ahead.
That's right. You go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So what I would say is, is look out for the avoidance. I mean, that's, look for where are you avoiding things and or escaping from the reality by imagining alternative scenarios. And the other, which we didn't talk much about, but is really important, build some positive experiences into your life. Having positive emotions, even if even if it seems like it's impossible, but doing something and gradually building on that, the positive emotions are possible during the most intense grief period. We know that, and they are healthy. They help us problem solve and they help us physiologically.
Very good. Mary Frances,
Leave it at that.
Go ahead. Oh, you're gonna leave
Perfect.
it? Okay.
Yep.
Well, we'll
no,
get to
that
you.
was
We'll get
perfect.
to you in 5 minutes. We'll get your answers in after hours. Everyone, thank you so much for joining FAN. We hope to see you at more programs this month and every month. Thank you so much, Dr. Scheer and Mary Frances, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Thanks, everybody, and good night.